Yes, and I'm just struck by how we're seeing, the evolution of so many different new alliances. We've come into this G20 with much more close relations between Korea and Japan, for example. But I'm also wondering about what your take is, Professor, concerning the possible dilution of the effectiveness of G20 with so many additional members. On the one hand, there's the upside of having more representation, but on the other, we're already seeing so much difficulty reaching consensus on something like the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so that's certainly correct, but I think it's helpful to also focus on some of the positives here. Now, the Chinese leadership has obviously decided not to give India's G20 summit its full support, but that can be an opportunity for others. And I've been very interested to see some of the meetings that have either already taken place or being planned, such as that between Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden. Also, I'm originally from the UK, and so interested in the opportunities for UK-India relations as well. So whilst others might not really be giving their full support to this organization, it is an opportunity for others to make use of the summit and really cement closer ties between the countries.
All right. Thanks, James. And now I'd like to cut across to our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who's on ground at Bharat Mandapam. Now, Siddhant, give us a brief about what all's happened there on ground while you've been there. You're seeing the action happen right in front of you. All the world leaders arriving one by one. We can make out from the visuals that we're getting. Talk to us more about what's all the action happening on there.
Well, what's interesting is how they are being welcomed by the Indian Prime Minister. There have been few moments of conversation as well. From what we can see from the visuals, it looked like the German Chancellor talked about his eye injury, how the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was welcomed by the Indian Prime Minister, both first doing a namaste and a warm hug as well. In fact, the Indian Prime Minister gave warm hug to two leaders with the UAE President as well. But these are body languages which we can interpret and see the warmth in the relationship. We can also see some cold handshakes as well. I'll not like to name those countries, but essentially the fact that the leaders have come here shows the focus here in Delhi, and also kudos to the Indian diplomacy in making sure that this event is underway, and of course how the world leaders have managed to come despite their very, very busy schedule.
I did notice, of course, you are noticing everyone's body language very closely. And I think that there is a little bit of fun in that, of course, reading a little beyond the lines in terms of how the different leaders have been greeted. Talk to us more about the warm hugs and the cold handshakes.
Well, I'll talk about the warm hugs first, UAE and with the UK Prime Minister, and we will see these warm hugs soon, perhaps with the American President, with the Saudi Crown Prince, who just arrived earlier today, and of course a few conversations as well. I believe that the Italian Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister cracked some kind of joke because they had a good laugh in front of all the cameras there, but essentially they were leaders from Turkey, related? From Canada. But the fact that the fact that they are here in Delhi showcases their commitment to multilateralism and G20 being held in Delhi, and provides an opportunity for these leaders to engage with the Indian counterpart. When it comes to Turkey, we know the relationship hasn't been doing very well, but we have seen a change in stance of Turkey in many senses. Turkey has not been very vocal on Kashmir in past few years. In at least last 1 year, I haven't seen many vocal comments. With the Canadians, of course, there are thorny issues, but both sides do see potential as well. Trade is something, but of course, there's a pause on the trading relationship. Let's see how the relationship goes. But India-Canada relationship in the past have seen a lot of positivity as well, and there will be a pull aside as well here in Delhi. So will that pull aside lead to a wider positivity in the relationship is something that will be closely watched.
Siddhant, do we know anything else about possible bilaterals with Prime Minister Modi and some of the other Southeast Asian nations like Joko Widodo, the Prime Minister of Indonesia, who we're seeing there?
Well, one thing I can say about Indonesia, since you mentioned Indonesia, the Indian Prime Minister was in Indonesia just this week. In fact, he was in Indonesia on Thursday. He arrived on Thursday back. He was there for the ASEAN meetings, the India-ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit. And this was the Indian Prime Minister's second visit to Indonesia in just last 1 year. That shows the engagement between India and Indonesia. In fact, they are planning a connectivity project as well that connects India's Andaman Islands to Aceh province in Indonesia. In fact, India and Indonesia are maritime neighbors, something that many might not be talking about because our focus is usually the geographical land neighbors. But focus is also on the cultural connectivity. Bali, we were there last year for the G20 Summit. This is a Hindu island, and of course, there are a lot of similarities between the culture of India and Bali. So, a lot of commonalities between India and Indonesia, but larger Southeast Asian country as well. I can point out to how the Indian Prime Minister welcomed the Singaporean Prime Minister as well, who is a special invitee during this year's G20 Summit.
Thanks, Siddhant. Stay with us. I'd just like to come back to our guest, James. James, now, India-ASEAN ties have definitely been on the rise, but, I have to mention here that Xi Jinping was missing at the recently concluded ASEAN summit. How much do you feel the multilateral reforms here at G20 could, I would say, undermine but kind of override the BRI initiative, the Belt and Road initiative for China? And do you think China is a little insecure about that? Jessica and me have been discussing this since the morning. And talk to us more about it.
Yeah, so I see Xi Jinping's non-attendance as really a key turning point. Up until this point, it seemed to be open to debate whether China would continue to play a full role within existing multilateral structures or would really turn its back on them and try and build structures that it feels that it can dominate. I think we have an answer to that question now. With the decision not to attend, it really seems that China has decided it wants to move away from these existing organizations. It wants to undermine them and instead to build its own competing structures.
It's really remarkable because it's benefited so very much from these multilateral organizations, the World Trade Organization in particular. Are you struck by that?
Yeah, and indeed, I'm quite worried about it. That I think it's a big strategic mistake. It seems to be a decision guided by the personal pride of Xi Jinping rather than China's own kind of strategic or economic interests. And when countries begin to make mistakes like that, it makes you wonder what other errors could they make.
I mean, we're already seeing assessments at Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, telling China, look, we don't have American companies that want to invest in China anymore because of the policies that you're putting out. I can imagine that's the same in India as well. Even besides the strategic tensions, there's a lack of desire to invest when you don't have a multilateral forum where everybody can come to the table and talk it out.
Yeah. And I think that, unfortunately, this is what we often see with authoritarian governments. When you have one leader who has amassed so much power, who has been in the position for so long, they're no longer getting such good advice. It happens so often that they end up being surrounded by advisors who just tell them what they want to hear. And that's where you get these own goals being scored.
Recommend then for countries that are so reliant? I mean, China is a critical part of the global economy. You can't really decouple thoroughly. And that's an argument everyone's having.
Exactly. And
Everybody's
US has made it clear.
that.
We don't want to decouple. We want to de-link in a manner and kind of just distance.
But even that is difficult. That's the struggle that all these countries are facing now, isn't it?
In 2022, I think the trade between China and US, it had surged. So they can't really kind of just disconnect completely. So how do you draw a line here? I mean, talk to us about that, James.
Yeah, this is something which is very prominent in discussions within Japan, which is that China is seen as the biggest security threat to Japan, but is also the most important economic partner. So you sometimes still have politicians within the United States talking about decoupling. But in Japan, there's a very clear recognition that is simply impossible. And so the argument which is made from Japanese leaders is, despite the difficulties, engagement politically with China remains very, very important. And so from the G20, even though the Chinese president is not here, I'd like to hear the message from others encouraging China to continue to engage with existing multilateral structures, to raise the idea that reforms can be made. Perhaps some of China's concerns can be addressed. But it's not good for any of us if China walks away from these.